Okay, this is video lesson 1.6. Excuse me, those of you who talked to me today know that I'm not feeling 100%. So, this is all going to be about the effects on the economy and how people viewed classes in society. So similar to what we're talking about with our project. Okay, first of all, the Industrial Revolution happened. And then industrialism spread, first to Belgium, France, and the German states, because Germany was not unified as one country at this time. So they had many different principalities. So they spread first to these countries and then eventually to the rest of Europe and Australia and America and Canada, places where governments were active in economically promoting industrialization. So places where you might have businesses or people saw the benefit of all these industrializing, and also places that had the resources to and the capital or money to do this. So by 1850, the Industrial Revolution as a revolution kind of ends around 1800, but industrializing or industrialism, that continues on through the 19th century or the 1800s. And by 1850, a network of railroads connected continental Europe and Great Britain. So these places were all very connected, which greatly enhanced communication and trade. More ideas flowed, more money flowed, and more connections were made. In North America, we had the steam engine, and so Robert Fulton actually created the steamboat. So the steamboat allowed you to travel inwards in America through all our river systems, which was very beneficial. And we also had railroads, so that helped spread goods and connect the industrialized Northeast with the wild, wild West out, in cowboy territory, in the Midwest, Oklahoma, Arizona, those kinds of places, California. So the result of all this, all these increased communication and transportation and trade, is that Western Europe and North America become much wealthier than the rest of the world. So that's why we call it today the first world. They were the first to industrialize. They become so much wealthier that it's not even comparable, and still today we see the same thing. So Karl Marx is a German scholar, and he saw all of this industrializing happening, and he saw these two new classes emerge in society, the factory owners and the factory workers. Remember, we talked about how those were the two new classes that emerged in society. So the capitalists, who were the factory owners, were the oppressors who kept the oppressed, or the working class, dependent on the means of production. And the working class did not have any control over their factories, over when they worked, over the machines they worked on, over their promotions, anything like that. So you're going to hear this term means of production when we talk about these economic systems. The means of production are any physical, non-human resources used in producing goods. So these are machines, factories, tools, etc. So the oppressors are the bourgeoisie, and he kind of coined these terms borrowing from the French Revolution. So the oppressors are the bourgeoisie. Think of bougie, and think of, kind of the bouginess that people might have an air that they're better than some people. And the oppressed is the proletariat. That's the working class, who Karl Marx thought that these oppressed people, the proletariat, they did not have any power. So they were forced to work these long hours without any breaks, like we talked about before. So he wanted the proletariat to violently overthrow, these were his words, the bourgeoisie, and form a government dictatorship to control the means of production. So he thought ultimately the ultimate form of society would be that government owned all of the means of production. So government would own the machines, factories, tools, and governments would hire the workers, governments would hire the supervisors. Everybody would be at the will of the government, and the government would be the one making money. So that is the highest form, he thought, of society. That was communism. People would live as a community. But there are two other economic systems before that. So first, we start with capitalism. And capitalism is what we have in the United States, but before all these government regulations were in place, it was even more severe. So capitalists believe that government should have little to no role in economics. They shouldn't mandate a minimum wage, set workday, hours worked in a week, those kinds of things. So the private business owners should be the ones to be able to control that, and they should be able to make private wealth without the government interfering. And they also believe that citizens should have the potential to make as much money as possible. But we know from our studies that this is not really realistic, because if you don't start out with a little bit of cash, then you can't make the most cash possible. There are very few stories where where the rags to riches really comes true. Okay, our next one down the line is socialism. So socialists believe that government plays a larger role in economics by ensuring that the lower class is taken care of. So people would pay higher taxes to ensure that people don't go broke or in debt, trying to afford a nice place to live, education, healthcare, those kinds of things. Those are provided by the state, so that people, even if they make less money, they can have the same standard of living as the rest of the classes. And so that the government's role is to ensure that working people make a certain amount, and that the wealthy are taxed enough to provide for the poor for the things that, or lower classes, not even the poor, to provide so that they can live. Then communism is what Karl Marx said was the highest form of society. And you can see on our chart here that communism is the most government power, but the least economic freedom, while capitalism is the least government power and the most economic freedom. So communism believed that the government should have total control over every business and industry. They should all belong to the government. Private citizens, like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, they should not own any of the private businesses or industries. Those would all be, USA Technologies. And there's no competition either. So there's no such thing as a private business or private wealth. Therefore, there are no social classes. Everyone is equally wealthy, but also equally poor. So the effects of this is that political parties around socialist and communist ideals were formed all over Europe. So we had socialist parties, communist parties spring up in these different countries throughout the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, which this becomes really important for where we're going in this course. So one of these parties is the National Socialistic German People's Party, which is also known as the Nazi Party. That was a socialist workers industrialist party. And some of these parties even still exist in countries around the world today. And we'll work on that more second semester when we talk about the Cold War. So before we had all these things, like government regulation of minimum wage and hours worked, there had to be something to start us moving in that direction, because it was obviously a problem. The income gap between the working class and the middle class, and the total power that the middle class had over the working class, was clearly a problem. So eventually, Karl Marx was partly right, and the proletariat started protesting for their working rights and working in better working conditions. So they formed what they called trade unions, which, think about today. Teachers have the teachers union. The truck drivers have Teamsters union. There are all these different industries that have a union to bargain for their rights. So these were first developed to help workers fight for their rights against their oppressive employers, the bourgeoisie. And in 1870, they finally won the right to strike in England. And so this means that workers could stop working entirely in order to protest and negotiate their rights. So they use these strikes to raise wages, better working conditions, and gain negotiating power. For instance, we shouldn't have to work unless you provide shoes for us children, or that children shouldn't have to work at all. So this led to the establishment of many things that we still have today, such as minimum wage, standard working shifts. It cut down from the 19-hour day to 12-hour day to a 10-hour day to finally an 8-hour day. And it also instated some required breaks. So for instance, if you work 8 hours, you have to have an hour for lunch. There has to be weekends, paid vacations, those kinds of things. Also, if you work longer than that, you get paid more money. You can only be fired for certain things, so it wasn't just if your employer didn't like you, he could fire you. You actually had to do something wrong. And also working conditions regulations. In these textile factories, the lint would go into the lungs of the workers, and they would cause these awful diseases. So actually, in some of the textile factories in North Carolina in the 1960s, a lot of these textile workers who had gotten this black lung disease from the lint factories sued their employer, and they were able to do that in better working conditions because of these trade unions. And so they were successful in Great Britain, and they were somewhat successful elsewhere. They're very controversial in the United States, I should say. And definitely they help people in some ways, but they also hurt industries in other ways. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding trade unions. The other thing that changed as a result of this industrialization is education, because as you saw those pictures, you could see that the children were not going to school because they were being paid to make money at the factories. So Britain realized this was a problem for their society, and in about 1833 they established that there would be no child labor in the Factory Act of 1833, but there was lots of other things that came along with that. But between 1870 and 1914, some things really began to change in terms of education. Governments began to set up state-financed primary schools. Before, schools were entirely private, so no matter what, you had to pay to go to school. They were not required to attend before this time period. So if you couldn't afford school, you were most likely in pretty desperate needs. And the other thing was, you could probably use some extra money. If your kid didn't have to go to school, you might as well send them to the factories. So this all began to change. So now children up to the age of 12 were required to attend school. Still, most in this working class family did not attend school much after the age of 12, but they at least knew how to read and write, which was obviously very important for the advancement of society. So there's this overall increase in literature, and so literature and reading became a way for everyone to receive information as well as entertainment. So this is when really mass-produced entertainment becomes popular. So authors would write novels just for the sake of entertaining the masses instead of just the exclusive rich people who could afford books before this. And overall, this led to a more skilled workforce than at the very onset of the Industrial Revolution, where people were just desperately grabbing for jobs. This led to people being able to read and write, as well as wanting to go to college, and eventually with more industrialization and technology, people had to work those middle-level jobs like a secretary and a telegraph corresponder and different jobs that we now think of typically as white-collar today. Okay, so remember the video quiz will be above this post in Edmodo, so it will be right after this video is posted.